What if I told you that Iranian bombers are now parked on Russian soil, and that behind closed Kremlin doors, whispers of nuclear support for Tehran are growing louder by the hour? This isn't fiction, it's the new reality. A reality where two of the West's most dangerous adversaries are no longer operating in isolation but side by side, with a shared mission to shake the global order to its core. In a moment that caught the attention of military observers and intelligence agencies across the globe, Iranian long-range bombers reportedly touched down at a Russian air base near Moscow, marking a turning point in Middle Eastern and Eurasian strategic dynamics. The sight of Iranian military aircraft landing on Russian soil is more than symbolic. It is a display of hard power diplomacy and strategic alignment in the face of mounting Western pressure. The Iranian regime, long considered an isolated pariah by much of the Western world, has now demonstrated its ability to project military influence far beyond its borders and into the heart of a nuclear superpower's territory. This deployment not only reflects Iran's increasing confidence, but also the Kremlin's willingness to deepen its military and political ties with Tehran at a level unseen in modern history. The landing of these bombers is not just a logistical maneuver. It's a message, a clear signal that Iran no longer acts alone in defiance of the West. It moves now under the shade of a Russian strategic umbrella. These aircraft, likely models capable of carrying conventional or advanced guided munitions, represent an expanded radius of potential Iranian influence. Their presence in Moscow indicates a high level of trust and coordination between the two governments, especially considering the strict airspace controls around the Russian capital. This trust has not emerged overnight. It is the result of years of behind-the-scenes coordination, tactical arms sales, joint engineering projects, and geopolitical convergence driven by mutual hostility toward American and Israeli policies. For years, Iranian military planners have looked eastward for technology, resources, and diplomatic cover. The partnership with Russia has evolved through proxy conflicts in Syria, drone technology transfers, and oil trade sanctions workarounds. However, this new development suggests something far more alarming: a shared military doctrine, or possibly a joint operational command. The possibility that Russian air bases could serve as forward operating posts for Iranian air missions changes the calculus for any potential Israeli or American strike on Iran's strategic assets. If Iran can now operate, refuel, or shelter aircraft from within Russia, any preemptive or retaliatory strike risks escalating into a direct conflict with the Kremlin, a scenario no Western strategist wants to entertain lightly. This movement comes amid ongoing tensions in the Middle East, where Israel's aggressive posture toward Iran's nuclear facilities and missile programs has pushed both countries to the edge of war. By positioning its bombers in Moscow, Iran is effectively raising the stakes. It is not just threatening retaliation from its own soil, but from a location that complicates both military engagement and international law. An attack on those bombers might be interpreted as an attack on Russian territory, triggering a broader geopolitical fallout. The implications are not limited to military strategy. They bleed into diplomacy, alliances, and energy politics. With Iranian aircraft now stationed in proximity to Russian command infrastructure, NATO and its intelligence arms must reassess surveillance protocols, satellite prioritization, and potential response thresholds. Moreover, this act disrupts the traditional understanding of regional conflict zones. Until now, the Israel-Iran rivalry was largely confined to the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, the Gulf, and covert cyber operations. But by extending its military footprint into Russia, Iran is internationalizing the conflict in a deeply destabilizing way. It's no longer just about Tehran and Tel Aviv. It's about how quickly local wars can become global crises when old powers offer sanctuary to unpredictable ones. The Iranian bombers in Moscow stand as symbols of a shifting world order, one where alliances are less about treaties and more about shared enemies, tactical leverage, and the willingness to upend norms. The arrival of Iranian bombers in Moscow has triggered intense speculation about their intended role, with military analysts divided between two major possibilities: that these aircraft are part of joint military drills between Iran and Russia, or, more ominously, that they are strategically positioned for future operations. In both cases, the implications are staggering. Joint drills would signal a formalization of military ties between Tehran and the Kremlin, elevating the partnership from clandestine collaboration to an open military alliance. On the other hand, if the bombers are there for operational staging, possibly for retaliation, deterrence, or nuclear posture coordination, then the West faces an entirely new set of challenges that shift the balance of military power across Eurasia. If these bombers are participating in coordinated exercises, it would mark the first publicly acknowledged large-scale military cooperation between the Islamic Republic and the Russian Federation. While Russia has conducted joint drills with China and even limited ones with countries like India and Turkey, the involvement of Iran, a nation still subject to international sanctions and viewed as a destabilizing actor by much of the world, would be a clear message of alignment against the Western-led international order. These drills could involve aerial coordination, strategic targeting simulations, electronic warfare testing, or long-range strike preparation. Such exercises, even if defensive in theory, could rapidly become offensive in practice if either partner decides to deploy assets in response to Western or Israeli actions in the Middle East. This possibility is amplified by the geopolitical context. Israel has recently intensified its surveillance and military pressure on Iranian targets in Syria and Lebanon, while Iran has responded with ballistic missile launches and threats of escalation. If the bombers are positioned in Russia as a signal of backup, then their mere presence could serve as a deterrent, a way of forcing Washington and Tel Aviv to reconsider any military action that might provoke Russian involvement. This is particularly significant given the lessons from Ukraine, where Western powers have been cautious not to directly engage Russian forces, despite overwhelming support for Kiev. By extending its air force into Russian airspace, Iran could be daring Israel to make a move that would automatically draw Russia into the conflict, at least diplomatically if not militarily. However, there's also a darker, more strategic interpretation. The placement of Iranian bombers on Russian bases could mean the creation of a long-term forward deployment capacity. This would allow Iran to strike from a safer location, far removed from the reach of Israeli jets or American carrier groups in the Gulf. It also introduces the potential for Russia to share targeting intelligence, satellite imagery, and advanced avionics technology, significantly upgrading Iran's combat capabilities. If the deployment is more than symbolic, it may include the integration of command systems or even the testing of joint retaliatory procedures should either country come under attack. Such a scenario would change how threats are calculated in both Tel Aviv and Washington, where the assumption has long been that any Iranian aggression could be answered without triggering global war. For Russia, the benefits are also strategic. The Kremlin gains a loyal and unpredictable partner that can wreak havoc on Western interests in the Middle East, forcing the U.S. to stretch its resources across multiple theaters. Iran, in turn, gains a level of security and legitimacy that it has long sought, particularly amid rising tensions over its nuclear program. The deployment could be the precursor to more integrated military infrastructure, joint bases, weapon storage, or even shared nuclear doctrine. Whatever the precise nature of the bombers' mission, one thing is certain. Their presence in Russia marks a new chapter in global military alignment and destabilization. The recent hints from Kremlin insiders suggesting that Russia may provide Iran with nuclear defensive assistance under certain scenarios have sent shockwaves through global diplomatic and security establishments. This kind of nuclear posturing isn't made lightly, and when it comes from a state like Russia, already engaged in a full-scale war with Ukraine and at loggerheads with NATO, the consequences of such a development could be catastrophic. The notion that Russia, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and one of the largest nuclear powers on Earth, would even entertain providing any level of nuclear support to Iran is a radical deviation from long-standing global non-proliferation norms. The statements haven't come through official channels, but their deliberate leak to foreign media outlets and analysts is seen as a calculated act of strategic ambiguity. This ambiguity is a weapon in itself. By not fully confirming or denying intentions, Moscow keeps adversaries guessing, elevating the psychological impact on Western intelligence agencies and decision-makers. For years, the global nuclear consensus has revolved around preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons or technology that could lead to a weaponized program. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was built on this foundation, with multiple nations, including Russia, having been signatories at one time. Now, with Russia's war footing intensifying and its isolation from the West deepening, the calculus appears to be shifting. Rather than discouraging Iran's nuclear ambitions, Moscow may now see them as a bargaining chip, a tool of asymmetric leverage that can force the West to split its attention and stretch its resources even thinner. If Russia does offer any form of nuclear support, whether through shielding Iranian facilities with Russian defense systems, sharing civil nuclear technology with potential dual-use applications, or even deploying nuclear-capable platforms on Iran's behalf, it will be perceived as a game-changer. The international community would have to confront the reality that a new nuclear axis is forming, centered not on ideological unity but on shared strategic goals, to weaken American hegemony, challenge Israeli military dominance, and force a rebalancing of the global power structure. Iran has always maintained that its nuclear program is for peaceful energy purposes, but the suspicion surrounding its intentions has persisted for decades. A Russian endorsement or technical partnership would give Iran both the cover and the capability to accelerate its nuclear objectives without the immediate fear of Israeli or American strikes. Furthermore, the potential for Russian-supplied nuclear protection creates a new kind of deterrence. Just as NATO's nuclear umbrella has historically provided security to member states against Soviet or Russian aggression, Moscow could be signaling that Tehran is now part of a similar informal pact. If Israel were to bomb Iranian enrichment sites, would Russia respond? Would it activate air defense systems, retaliate with cyber operations, or provide logistical support for counterattack? None of this is clarified, and that's part of the danger. The lack of clarity means that all parties are operating in a high-stakes fog, where miscalculations become more likely. This nuclear ambiguity also adds pressure to regional dynamics. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which have long warned that they would pursue nuclear capabilities if Iran goes nuclear, may now feel an accelerated need to arm themselves. The Middle East, already a volatile region due to proxy wars, sectarian conflict, and foreign interventions, could descend into a nuclear arms race, with Russia quietly facilitating one side. The US and Israel, recognizing this possibility, may feel compelled to strike earlier and more decisively before the nuclear deterrence hardens into an unbreakable shield. The mere suggestion of Russian nuclear support to Iran disrupts decades of containment and diplomacy, sending the message that a new era of hardline nuclear geopolitics is emerging. The strategic alliance unfolding between Iran and Russia, particularly in the wake of Iranian bombers landing near Moscow, and the Kremlin's hints at nuclear support, has forced Western intelligence agencies into a heightened state of alert. For years, the relationship between Tehran and Moscow was viewed through the lens of opportunistic coordination, limited to arms deals, energy swaps, and aligned interests in the Syrian civil war. But what is now emerging appears to be far more organized, more structured, and deeply rooted in military planning that challenges the existing global order. The convergence of two anti-Western regimes with combat experience, advanced weaponry, and nuclear ambitions creates a volatile alliance that Western intelligence cannot afford to miscalculate. The landing of Iranian aircraft on Russian soil wasn't just monitored, it was tracked in real time by NATO satellite and radar networks, and it triggered a flurry of emergency briefings across Western capitals. NATO scrambled surveillance drones and reconnaissance aircraft to observe secondary movements, communications infrastructure being activated, fuel and weapon storage shifts, and electronic signals that might hint at joint command integration. Every movement is being scrutinized not only for its current tactical significance, but for what it reveals about future scenarios. The intelligence community understands that in such situations, it is not just the physical presence of bombers that matters, but the invisible architecture behind them. Data sharing links, encrypted communications, GPS integration, and the presence of Russian military advisors possibly embedded within Iranian crews. One of the gravest concerns among analysts is that these deployments may not be temporary. If the alliance continues to deepen, intelligence services fear the potential establishment of permanent or semi-permanent Iranian military infrastructure within Russian territory or within the buffer zones Moscow controls, such as parts of Syria or Crimea. This scenario would completely alter the defensive strategies employed by Israel and the United States in the Middle East. The possibility that Iran might strike not only from its own borders but from Russian territory under Kremlin protection makes it exceedingly difficult to plan preemptive or reactive strikes without escalating into direct conflict with Russia. This, in turn, pushes the threshold for military action into far more dangerous territory. Intelligence agencies are also dissecting the possibility that this axis might begin to coordinate not just on physical deployment, but on cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, and electronic espionage. Both Russia and Iran have well-established offensive cyber capabilities, with Tehran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, having launched numerous cyber attacks against Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Western institutions, while Russia has spent the last decade undermining democratic systems and spreading disinformation across Europe and the United States. A coordinated cyber warfare doctrine between these two powers would vastly expand their asymmetric capabilities and could be used to weaken Western responses, disable early warning systems, or sow confusion in the early stages of any military escalation. Western intelligence services are also being forced to reassess their assumptions about deterrence. Traditional deterrence relied on the idea that Iran, isolated and economically strained, could be contained through sanctions, threats of retaliation, and strategic ambiguity. But now, with Russian backing and potential access to nuclear defenses, that equation becomes unstable. Iran becomes less predictable and more emboldened. Surveillance of Iranian missile sites, nuclear facilities, and command centers is being expanded, and Western satellite constellations are being retasked to focus more heavily on Eurasia's northern and southern axis. The coordination between Moscow and Tehran has introduced a new layer of unpredictability to the already volatile region, and it has fundamentally shifted the timeline of potential conflict. The West no longer has the luxury of assuming that escalation will be limited to the Middle East, or that time is on its side. The Iran-Russia alliance is now a prime focus of real-time surveillance, predictive modeling, and high-level threat assessments. The presence of Iranian bombers on Russian soil has set off alarm bells in Tel Aviv, where Israeli defense officials now face the reality of a new and far more dangerous strategic environment. For decades, Israel has maintained a posture of overwhelming military superiority in the region, particularly in the air, with capabilities to strike anywhere from Tehran to Damascus with precision and speed. But this sudden, high-profile cooperation between Iran and Russia is a signal that the era of Israeli regional dominance may be entering a phase of dangerous uncertainty. Iranian aircraft stationed near Moscow are not just beyond the range of typical Israeli airstrikes, they are effectively protected by the geopolitical shield of a nuclear-armed superpower. This changes Israel's threat perception calculus entirely. For Israeli military planners, the implications are profound. The country has long relied on its ability to conduct preemptive strikes against threats before they materialize into full-scale dangers, from bombing nuclear reactors in Iraq and Syria to launching targeted operations deep inside Iran. However, those strategies were based on the assumption that Israel would be acting alone or against countries that lacked meaningful alliances with global powers. Now, if Iran is able to operate with strategic depth from within Russia's borders, any Israeli strike risks triggering a confrontation with Moscow. This isn't just about military retaliation from Russia. It's about diplomatic fallout, energy crises, potential trade sanctions, and the unraveling of already tense relations between Jerusalem and Western powers that may be reluctant to back a move that could widen the war. What makes this development more alarming is that it signals a shift in deterrence dynamics. Previously, Israel's conventional and nuclear deterrent capabilities kept Iran's ambitions largely in check, but the idea that Iranian bombers could now operate under Russian airspace, intelligence systems, or even anti-aircraft protection means that Iran can afford to be more aggressive without fearing immediate reprisal. Israeli defense analysts have already started referring to this new dynamic as a potential Eurasian front, a new axis of military activity that stretches far beyond the traditional Middle East theater and into regions where Israel cannot easily project power. In essence, the Israeli military is now forced to plan for a scenario where its enemies are not only operating from safe havens, but are being protected by a state that has veto power at the United Nations Security. The diplomatic implications for Israel are equally severe. For years, Israel has relied on quiet coordination with both Washington and Moscow to conduct surgical strikes against Iranian targets in Syria without triggering Russian interference. There has been a careful balancing act, with Israel ensuring it did not directly provoke Russian forces while still targeting Iranian military assets. That balancing act now appears to be over. If Russia is offering Iran its strategic umbrella, then any Israeli aggression risks a diplomatic backlash that could see Moscow fully committing to Tehran's defense. This could result in the activation of Russian air defense systems in Syria or the sharing of sensitive intelligence with Iran that could compromise Israeli operations and expose its agents or missions in hostile territory. Furthermore, this shift is likely to affect Israeli domestic politics and military budgeting. The Israeli public, which has long trusted in the state's ability to neutralize external threats with minimal consequences, may now demand new strategies, additional military funding, and stronger alliances with the United States and regional powers like Egypt and the Gulf states. Political leaders will be under pressure to prove that Israel is not losing its deterrent edge in the face of a new alliance that brings together Iran's ideological extremism and Russia's military power. The arrival of Iranian bombers in Moscow has disrupted the strategic balance Israel once enjoyed and has introduced a level of geopolitical complexity that demands a complete reassessment of its regional defense doctrine. The emerging Iran-Russia axis is not only reshaping regional security dynamics but also pushing the United States and its NATO allies into a dangerous strategic dilemma. For decades, Washington has focused on containing Iran's regional ambitions through a mix of economic sanctions, covert operations, and military deterrence. Simultaneously, it has managed the threat posed by Russia through NATO expansion, arms control treaties, and support for Eastern European allies. But now, with Tehran and Moscow signaling deeper military and possibly nuclear cooperation, the two most defiant adversaries of the West are effectively merging their spheres of resistance into a single, coordinated front. This convergence forces Washington to rethink its two-theater strategy, potentially stretching its military and diplomatic resources across Eurasia and the Middle East in ways that it hasn't had to since the Cold War. The United States is now faced with the possibility that Iran may no longer be acting as an isolated regional threat, but as a heavily fortified partner under the security umbrella of a global nuclear power. If Iranian bombers are operating from Russian territory or are protected by Russian air defense systems, then the calculus of preemptive military options changes completely. Any attack on Iranian military assets could be interpreted as a provocation against Moscow, forcing Washington into a crisis management scenario that it is ill prepared for, especially while still actively supporting Ukraine. This forces American policymakers into a position of strategic hesitation, constrained from acting decisively in the Middle East for fear of escalating into a broader Eurasian conflict. NATO, too, is rattled by this development. European powers, already fatigued by the drawn-out conflict in Ukraine and nervous about energy dependence on foreign powers, now have to contemplate a new layer of complexity. A more emboldened Iran, operating with Russia's support, threatens the already fragile balance in regions like the Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Gulf. The prospect of Iranian missiles being backed by Russian radar intelligence or cyber support makes existing missile defense systems in Europe appear outdated or insufficient. NATO must now consider reinforcing its southern and southeastern flanks, extending air defense networks, and possibly redeploying naval forces to monitor Iranian-Russian cooperation in the Caspian Sea, Black Sea, or Persian Gulf. For Washington's Middle East allies, particularly Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, the signals from the Iran-Russia partnership are deeply unsettling. These countries have traditionally relied on the U.S. security umbrella to shield them from Iranian aggression, but now they must question whether that umbrella can hold under the weight of global escalation. The U.S. is being pressured to offer stronger guarantees, more arms deals, more joint exercises, and possibly even mutual defense treaties. But with so many flashpoints active at once, American capacity to deliver credible deterrence everywhere is under strain. The Iran-Russia axis forces the U.S. to make hard choices about where to prioritize its strategic weight. The risk is not only military but also diplomatic. The longer Iran and Russia present a united front, the more likely it becomes that other nations, those caught between East and West, might lean toward this rising bloc. Nations like Turkey, India, and even Brazil are closely observing whether the West can maintain dominance or whether the multipolar world order is solidifying. If Washington appears weak or indecisive in the face of this new alliance, it could lose more than strategic ground. It could lose global credibility. The symbolic weight of Iranian bombers landing in Moscow is greater than any one military deployment. It represents a challenge to the entire structure of post-Cold War power. The United States and NATO are now locked in a race not just to respond, but to redefine their role in a world where former regional threats are joining forces to challenge the global order itself. The unfolding alliance between Iran and Russia is more than a diplomatic shift. It's a seismic realignment of global power that threatens to upend decades of Western strategy. With Iranian bombers landing in Moscow and whispers of nuclear support echoing from the Kremlin, we are witnessing the birth of a new axis that dares to challenge U.S. dominance, NATO deterrence, and Israeli military superiority all at once. This isn't just about joint drills or symbolic gestures. It's about two defiant powers signaling to the world that they are ready to rewrite the rules. The West now faces a stark choice: adapt to this new threat with urgency, unity, and strength, or be caught flat-footed as the balance of power shifts before our very eyes.